Okay, welcome back to our afternoon for joint appropriations on this new year. We have UW on a call back to basically, I think, go Don, just going to reiterate what we're going to do with our friends from across the hill.
Mr. Chairman, I believe the UW operating budget was discussed, and there were some questions about their capital construction projects as well as their ARP projects. And I think the consensus at that time was that any discussion of those items should be delayed for purposes of the callback, and today is that callback. Okay,
that being the case. Mr. President, please come on up. Let's get this show on the road. So by the way, when you present on your CapCon, what I would like to know, on some of these projects, they're 2 to 4 years old, and we're using those dollars. And the world's changed since then. I mean, the cost of construction and cost of labor, cost of materials have all changed dramatically. And so if you have evaluated those numbers, update us with those numbers and how you came up with them, and so that we understand, because we want to work in realities, not past tense. So, all right, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'd like to ask Alex Keene and Bill Nye to come up just to be ready to help support. If it's all right, I'd like to just make a couple opening remarks. I won't take too much time, but I just, first of all, want to thank you for bringing us back and giving us a chance, and for support over the years. And as you know, we've invited you to come join us tomorrow afternoon, if that still works, or we could potentially delay for a week when there will be a basketball game. At least the AD is here to promise that.
Before you go on, we discussed that over the noon hour, and our inclination is to do it next week.
Next week.
Right.
All right. So we're happy to do that. But you'll be able to have a chance to see some of the fruits of your investments over the years, particularly the science building. And so there are things we're eager to show you. I just also, I want to make sure we have a moment just so we can see the forest for the trees. I just feel that the university is really on the move in the last while, in spite of budget issues that we've been facing. In particular, as you know, back in November, the board approved major organizational changes to the university that we're moving forward on executing, that amount to some investments in the College of Engineering, moving some departments in there, to College of Agriculture, moving life sciences in there. So we're in the process of doing that. And that's probably the most significant organizational change in decades. We also have been working hard to reposition the university for economic impact in the state in multiple ways. And one of the things that we're implementing now is a center-wide or university-wide Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation that will be working. Steve Farkas is here to speak to that a little bit later, if you would like. In particular, that helps to power the Wyoming Innovation Partnership, which we also would be pleased to talk about if you'd have some questions about it. We also have a new hospitality and tourism program that is underway, and that is something that we're trying to make sure we align with the state's needs around economic outcomes, and we're very focused on that. And then I am very proud of what we've done to organize with the governor's office and the presidents of the community colleges, the Wyoming Innovation Partnership, that is working to align higher education in a way that I don't think has quite ever happened before in Wyoming, working to focus on collaborative work that is targeted for specific economic outcomes, to grow entrepreneurship and new businesses across the state, a big computing initiative to raise digital literacy across the entire state. Many of the community colleges are working with us now to already implement software engineering programs that would have impact in agriculture and so on. And this Thursday, the Board of Trustees will consider a proposal that we have to them to authorize a school of computing at the university. That would be a university-wide activity that would raise digital literacy, would raise our ability to bring in additional revenue streams, which is very important, especially with state funding limited. We want to be able to do that both with corporate partnerships and with agency support from like National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and so on. So we have done all of this in the last year and a half. And so I think just want you to get a sense that we're on the move, and we'd be happy to talk about that when you come visit us in person. We're prepared to talk about today the CapCon request, and so we'll probably start with that if it's your pleasure. Also to talk about the ARP request from the University of Wyoming, there were a number of ranked priority items that I think we'd be happy to go through in order of importance, and then also to talk about the WIP initiative. And on that, I just want to make one last comment. We are very well organized. We have a meeting every Tuesday afternoon in the University of Wyoming that has about 24 people attending, that Steve Farkas oversees, to make sure that we are prepared as a university to support the initiative. We also have a president's steering group with all the presidents of all the community colleges, and we meet not exactly weekly, but I'd say every other week regularly with working groups on implementing plans that we have in place. And so it's something that I think could potentially really have a lot of impact. So I'll stop there just to prime the pump a little bit for maybe some questions later. We've assembled our team. We have people here from all aspects of the university to answer questions, and happy to start if you'd like with the CapCon request.
So any questions for President Seidel? Go ahead, Senator Greer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Talk to us a little bit about how you see it integrating with the community colleges. To be honest, we've had a couple of attempts at this in the past that have met with greater and lesser success, and in some minds, I think, at least, and I'll just talk about me. In my mind, sometimes I wonder, are we ready for this? Is this the time? So help me out with that.
Thanks, Senator Giroux. So I'm really extremely excited about it, to be honest. I've come here, I've spent a lot of time getting to know the presidents of community colleges. In fact, before I came here, I called virtually all of them personally just to get to know them, and had preliminary conversations with Governor Gordon about the idea that we could align higher education to work together in not just like transfer students and get along better, but to have new programs that are specifically aligned at moving the state forward. So we look at market sectors and things that are important across the whole state and things that are important in everyone's backyard. And one thing we've certainly agreed on is that entrepreneurship and business creation, the training of students in entrepreneurship, as well as having an incubator where students and faculty alike can have companies started, and then even thinking about how we support the growth of those companies through mentorship and through venture capital that would support the initiation of companies. All of these things are being discussed, and the University of Wyoming is prepared to step up its own game, and so are the community colleges in collaboration. This includes courses that are being created together on training entrepreneurs. The same thing in the computing area. We know it's important not just to learn computer science, but to learn how computing applies, say, to agriculture. So last week, you might have watched the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. John Deere just unveiled a completely autonomous tractor. No place for somebody to sit. You can monitor it from an iPhone. Volvo just introduced its new autonomous vehicles. They say you'll be able to, in 2 years, drive to lunch while you're reading a book. And they say software will be one of their biggest revenue sources for Volvo. And so these are just examples. And so what we want to do is work collectively across the whole state to make sure that we have training, we have corporate partnerships with companies, Deere in particular. I happen to know the former CTO of Deere. And so we would then build up the structure so that not just the University of Wyoming, but all of our partners with the community colleges can work together on such things.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Please go ahead.
President Seidel, we see President Seidel, we see, some requests in the ARPA funds for another pretty significant amount for that program for phase 2 and phase 3. We've evidently, I think we put around 27 million into this first phase. So could you just kind of tell us what you have and are doing with that initial amount? Then tell us why it's critical, or tell us what is the critical amount to help this move forward and why. Just lay me out a map so that, and then help me to understand that if we don't do this, or provide the information, let me make my decision on if we don't do this, that we'll look back and say, we missed the boat.
Sure. Thanks, Representative Larson. So in the first round of funding, $27 million, that's split almost equally. The university has a little bit more than the community colleges, but it's set up basically for pilot projects that have very specific deliverables around getting software engineering programs going, getting entrepreneurship programs going, getting a hospitality program that's in collaboration with some of the community colleges and also backed by the tourism board as well. And so this is laying the foundation for these projects. They have very specific deliverables, and that's why our teams are meeting as often as they are now to make sure that we're prepared in the next 6 months to a year in order to make sure we actually deliver those, get these programs started up, create the office, the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation that has a corporate partners program that will support not just UW, but the community colleges as well. And then the second round of funding in phase 2 and then 3 is dependent in part on our delivering those first deliverables from the phase 1 funding, but then they will also have themselves in rounds 2 and 3 their own deliverables. So this isn't just giving money, this is giving money with specific outcomes that would have to be delivered and progress measured. We have we have working groups for every one of these areas. We have the president's steering group that meets regularly. We meet with the governor's office also regularly to monitor progress and make sure we're on a good track. So I would say if the funding is not given for phase 2 and 3, the phase 1 funding will help us get started, but it won't be as strong an investment if we don't follow it with the second round of funding. And what would happen is basically opportunity lost. I think we have a new form of cooperation with the community colleges. So just imagine aligning all of higher education in a state for economic outcomes. That's what we're trying to do with very specific programs. And Steve Farkas is here, could talk in more detail about some of the specifics, but it's really come together, particularly in the last 6 months as we meet together with the community college presidents.
And over the years, since I've been in the legislature, I came in just at the time that we were putting all the investment in the engineering programs, and we recognize and believe the need to have investment from the private sector. And so what you just said is corporate partners in this program. And so I'm interested, if you are to the point that you're having discussion with potential corporate sponsors or partners, and how that is being received, or so if you could just
Sure.
enlighten me there a little, please. Thanks,
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson. We are having discussions with a lot of corporate partners, some local partners like Tri-Hydro, other companies in the tech space in the state of Wyoming, for example, or also national companies. Caterpillar, I've had conversations with some of the leadership at the educational programs at Caterpillar and others. And so the model is that it's not just that the companies would provide money, say, to the foundation, the UW Foundation for philanthropy, but it's more like a partnership, but they will help support programs around students in internships, around faculty sponsored research and contracts that we would have with them. We have also in the oil and gas industry, the Mohammed Piri is, in fact, we'd be able to give a little presentation, I think next week when we get together, on corporate partners that we have with many of the oil companies, for example, where they're much more engaged, many more opportunities for our students, and then potentially to attract companies. I met with a company that I helped convince move to Cheyenne. Recently, Armin Ellis is the CEO of the company, came from JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab in California. And he said he needs to hire about 24 people in artificial intelligence and applications. Can we provide that? At the moment, we don't have that many people that we're producing in the state there. So they would be interested in helping support the development of programs that would train more students from across the state. So these are the kind of things that companies would work with us on. When I was in a former job as a director of a national center for supercomputing applications, I had about 36 partners, corporate partners that provided about $15 million a year in funding to my center. So these are the kinds of things that I think are possible if we built up the infrastructure here.
Thank you.
Okay. Now we're ready to go.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks.
So would you like to start with the CapCon request?
Yeah, let's do.
All right. We have a list here. Perhaps I think one thing that's on everyone's mind is the request for the stadium and the swimming pool. And maybe I would turn this over to Bill to get started.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Bill.
So in this long list of UW projects in capital construction, really only 2 of them were intended to be general fund requests. The remaining list was part of what was put together as a response to the governor's request for potential ARP funding projects. So just want to be clear up front, it doesn't really reflect that in the narratives. Well, the narratives do, but the summary numerical tables don't. So the biggest of the 2 main general fund requests is the pool and stadium. We've discussed this with you for a number of years. And we do have Tom Berman here if you have specific questions about it. To your point that you made in your opening remarks, what is the real cost of building this pool and stadium now? So what you see here is a request for and a governor's recommendation for a total of $74.3 million. Now, those numbers go back a ways. As you'll recall, there were in prior sessions, that is the same dollar amount that was requested back 3-4 years ago. And these numbers were actually developed, I would say, 5 years ago. So right up until the last time you really heard this request, which was a couple of years ago at least, UW had assumed, I think, that we would somehow absorb differences between when those numbers were initially derived and where we were at that point in time. In other words, there might be some everybody's favorite term, value engineering of the projects, or there might be some additional fundraising that was done. This has gotten to a point now where I personally don't believe that either one of those approaches is possible. I think you're really looking at $100 million project here to not reduce the scope of those original projects. So I would say even since May, when these were submitted to the budget office, you've seen an awful lot of increased cost to maintain that same scope.
So how did you come up with that number?
The $100 million, Mr. Chairman. We have a campus architect, which I know a number of you have worked with, and he has gone back through the numbers and worked with the consulting architects to refine the number, to update the number.
So that means they did a calculation, probably. Can you provide us that copy of what the calculation?
We can, Mr. Chairman.
I'd just like to see how they did it.
We will do that.
I mean, essentially, that's a 30% increase.
It is, Mr. Chairman. I would say it's fully a 30% increase. Again, part of that's due to just the aging of the project itself. So if the question is, what does it cost to build the same project as originally envisioned with that 74? There's been a number of years that have passed. So you've got, annual inflation involved in it. And then, everybody's facing this recent uptick since, COVID hit. So we'll get you the analysis of that.
And then by project. I mean, I think we had 25 to 30 million for the pool, basically. So And I wonder if those, do they go up proportionally the same or is it different? That's what,
Mr. Chairman, I do not believe they went up proportionally. We will get you the numbers, but my latest recollection of that pool is 40 million. So out of the 100, it would be 40. So 10 over the original 30 or 28 or whatever that original number was. But we'll break it down for you.
okay. Any questions on that? All right. Then why don't you talk about the law school expansion? What's the numbers on that?
Mr. Chairman, I think on the law school expansion, again, you'll see that that was requested at $25 million. Conservatively, I would say, again, just based on what we've experienced since May, I would guess that this project is probably going to more closely approach 30 million. And that's again based on some preliminary analysis by our architect in consultation with the project architects.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So recognizing costs have gone up and therefore you need more revenue, have you looked into whether you think your capacity to raise private funds is going to go up proportionally?
Mr. Chairman,
Proportionally.
Mr. Chairman, I think we have two experts in the room here who are very closely in touch with their constituents. And if you want to speak with them, I'm sure both of them would love the chance.
Well, we'd love to speak with the experts who know the answers.
Mr. Chairman,
Welcome. Yeah.
Representative Schwartz. The honest answer to that question is no, it won't be proportional. But I've been saying for the last couple of years that we could privately raise 15 million, most of it earmarked for the stadium. Unfortunately, there's not a real strong demand for the pool project. But I believe we can go to 20 million, and the way oil and gas is going in Wyoming, that's going to help us be able to achieve that number or maybe even eclipse it. But that isn't proportional to the increase. If I can just throw in a little story, because I was reviewing notes before I came here today. In 2012, we were in front of you. I was in front of you talking about the pool. And at that time, we were talking about a 50-meter pool with 1,500 seats capacity, a full-fledged Olympic diving well, a beautiful exterior pulled out to grand with lots of stone and glass, $19 million. It's time we do this project, even if it's different and it's a little smaller, but somebody's going to be in front of you down the road asking for a $60 million pool.
We want the old one.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
and Director Berman, thank you so much. On the pool, so pool's very old, needs to be replaced. What if we never do it? What happens? What happens to the program? What happens to the university?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, at some point, we probably drop men's and women's swimming. We would have to add another sport because we're required to have 16 sports per the NCAA Division I minimum. That would put us at 15. But presently, we train in the pool, in the Corbett pool, but we compete at Laramie High School, and we go on the road far more frequently than we should because teams will not compete in a 25-yard pool. So if we can't get into the high school to compete, which is high school is the schedule is very busy. It's very difficult. Then we will say to Air Force, well, we'll just go to your place, or San Diego State, we'll just come to your place. That's not a very good way to run a program.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
so,
Please.
and I missed part of your discussion, but what I heard was, and this would be for Bill, that the total cost, what we're looking at is about 100 million. Is that correct? And so based on that number, and there's a $74 million request, so that looks at about 25 million fundraising. So question for Tom, you said you could probably go out and get 20 million, so that still leaves you 5 million short. So those numbers aren't adding up, and maybe it's university reserve or something else. But the question I have is, so if we appropriated the money that's currently requested, how long does it take you to go out then and generate $25 million of matching money for these facilities? And then under that scenario, then if it takes some number of years to do that, then we come back and then have to inflation increase the budget to another $110 million. So how long is it going to take you to go get the money, Tom?
We can get pledges, I think, in 12 months if we start today, or 20 million. And we would try to keep those pledges less than 5 years. That's kind of about as quick as we can collect from our constituent base. But what we've done in the past with the High Altitude Performance Center, and one of the reasons why that project came in under budget and on time, was we partnered with the UW Foundation, and we're able to borrow money and fill that gap and then pay back. We had a little bit of debt service, but very minimal. We are almost paid off on that project now. And that is cheaper than waiting in the current inflationary market we're in today.
All right, thank you.
Well, and I take it, just to follow up on that, I know the trustees basically say you got to have money in hand before they'll approve it. And so I take it that that mechanism to funding is equivalent to money in hand.
I think we have trustees behind me, and I would let them comment. Unless they snuck away.
There's ways to structure the construction to true up with the cash flow of the project.
So I'm curious on the stadium. Theoretically, you want to have it down and up in one season. So you start the tear down after you finished your last December game or November game, and then you have it up by August 1st, right, or 31st.
Mr. Chairman, the tentative plan that we've discussed with architects is the west side of the venue is actually two separate structures. The lower level is not attached to the upper level, just kind of unique in the stadium. So we would blow up the lower level. We play on November 30th. On December 1, we blow up the lower level, redo the lower seating bowl, and begin construction on the concession, restrooms, ADA, first aid area, all of that, and get that up and done prior to the start of the next season. The upper level, and if we added in some sort of premium seating into that, may have to wait another year because we don't have enough capacity to have one either the
Side
top or
gone.
bottom offline.
And because they're two separate components, you could probably treat them as two separate construction projects for funding purposes and approval of the trustees. Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Berman. Kind of a follow-up to along the same line as Senator Higgs. So that we're not postponing and seeing an inflation of the project, do we we have drawings for construction now? Where are we at in that whole process on the stands and on the pool?
We do not, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, we do not have detailed drawings at the present time that are up to date. But we have what we call a phase one that'll get us started, and we have a pretty good idea of what the next step would be as soon as we're ready to go and get moving. But it's, we are not ready to start construction by any stretch of the imagination.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. And so then, Bill, the numbers you provided us take into account that time delay?
Mr. Chairman, it does, and it takes into account, again, the needs that were attempted to be filled in that initial scoping on both projects.
So then let's talk about the pool. What is your construction period for that? Is that something that can happen simultaneously with the stadium, or first come, first serve? What if we only fund it? What happens?
In my mind, it seems like there would be some economy of scale if we did both these projects at the same time, because they're right next to each other, and we could co-locate the construction site and make it more efficient. If we have to wait on the funding, as Senator Hicks and the trustees were discussing, that may cause an issue there. But it seems to me, from a layman's perspective, that if we could do these all at one time, we would have some economies of scale and maybe be a little more efficient. But I'm no expert in that. But I do know that the comment that Bill made regarding the numbers that we have at 100 million, I specifically asked Matt, the gentleman that worked with the architects, I said, are we talking about 2021 or are we talking about 23? And he said, these are 22, 23, 24 numbers. So I feel better about that.
And then to do the pool, what's the time frame to actually deconstruct and erect a new pool?
From what the information that I've got, it would be 12 to 18 months to finish the project from start to go. And so we would be displaced, and we would have to work very closely with the high school. And we've talked about our program would probably practice from 4:30 to 7:30 in the mornings.
So the city might charge a hall fee to haul all this stuff off campus. We'll see.
Mr. Chairman.
Just one second.
So the concern I have, everybody sitting, my UW friends, is we talk about combining this into one project, is that then you don't make a project that disqualifies the ability for our in-state contractors to do these projects. Makes me cranky as hell. And so we need to make sure in my mind, where I get an aye vote, that our Wyoming contractors are going to be included and be able to bid on these projects.
Mr. Chairman, understood. And I do want you to understand that and I appreciate the comment, but I want you to understand that we will take every effort to try to make sure that these stay with Wyoming contractors.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the pool front, there was some discussion of leaving the existing pool, building in the new one in a slightly different location, but very close proximity to the existing pool. Would that be a possibility to where the program could continue practicing and using the existing pool until the new one was done, and then demolition of the old one based on where the new one may be located, and just an expansion of thoughts from that point?
I was actually a proponent of that at one time, Representative Walters, but because I thought we would be able to save significant dollars by building a new standalone facility. But right now, that is not the answer I've been given, that we actually will save more money by building an extension to Corbett going to the south towards Grand Avenue. And our kids will be, our student athletes will be so thrilled to have a quality pool. If it takes 18 months, they're going to be fine.
So to follow up on that, knowing the lack of ever wanted to intermental in UW affairs, the idea of just expanding Corbett as opposed to building a new one raises some red flags for me. So I think we need to see designs and drawings and have a much better understanding of that and what's going to be left over. I mean, we've just done that on multiple occasions at the Wyoming Life Resource Center. We've done it at the state hospital and here in Cheyenne. And very seldom, if ever, do you get something, new construction, nice, that's going to last 50 years when you're remodeling something that's already. So that's just my experience. So.
Mr. Chairman, we'll get you all that information. And the one thing that makes this a little different is we're not remodeling. We are actually building an extension going, I mean, it'll be a new facility attached to Corbett for the most part. So it's not like we're tearing down walls and starting over, starting within there. Mr. Chairman, can I make one comment if it's appropriate?
You can always make a comment.
Mr. Chairman, he could make even inappropriate comments. I wouldn't suggest it.
I promise, I don't think it'll be inappropriate, but Bill and I were chatting and Bill said, if we do this stadium project, what is the incremental net gain in annual revenue that you see that the university athletics department could benefit from? And I think this is important as we go forward. One of the reasons why the stadium project is so important is it is likely, I'm a realist, that state funding is only going to decrease in the next 10 years or stay flat at the very best. So we need to find a way to make every Saturday as profitable as possible. And the stadium project on the west side would allow us to put in about 2,000 to 2,500 chairbacks with armrests and we believe a net revenue, even assuming some of those people have seats on the other side of the stadium and they open those, they leave those seats and buy new seats on the west, $500 to $550 per person per seat times 2,500 is like $1.2 million. And then if we did loge boxes, which are outdoor seating, but they're covered and they have radiant heat at the top of that lower level, if we could build roughly 100 seats in that section at about $1,500 per seat, that's another 150,000 annually. So it would take it would take $100 million endowment to generate those kind of revenues.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Berman, we've discussed this before. We've got X number of home games. What other uses for the stadium are envisioned?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz, there are limited uses because it's an outdoor venue in Laramie, Wyoming. But we do 6 regular season football games every year. We host the high school state championships, which is 4 games. We probably do 3 special events in the summer, movie nights, small concerts, 4th of July celebrations, et cetera. But those generate very little money, but they are good community events for us to support. But I don't want to send the impression that we're going to be a concert venue at 7,220 feet. We just have very tight.
If we get Zach Brown to come, would that make it work?
We would love Zach Brown.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Simpson.
I have 2 questions. First is for you, Tom. How accessible will this new Corbett gym be to the rank and file students?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Simpson, if we do loge boxes, the price point will be significantly lower than the Wildcatter, probably half, but it won't be available to the general public. And you just mentioned students, so.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm talking about the swimming pool.
Oh,
I
I'm
shifted
sorry.
gears on you, sorry.
The swimming pool, the one wonderful thing about the swimming pool, because it will be a 50-meter, 8-lane pool. Right now, we're a 25-yard, 5-lane pool. We practice for 8 hours a day. So very few people have access to Corbett Pool for anything, research, classes, recreation, because we're in there most all day long. And swimmers go 8 months a year hard. The new pool will cut that time down to about 4 hours a day. So there'll be more access for the general student body, more access for research, more access for classes that the university doesn't even offer hardly any classes, whether it be a kayaking class or a diving class or whatever, because we consume all the time in the pool presently. That'll be freed up because we'll have more lanes and we can get our miles in a more efficient time.
Thank you. And the second question, President Seidel, if we feel like we can only afford to do one of these this year, has your board prioritized which one you'd prefer for us to fund?
Mr. Chairman, Reverend Simpson, you mean between the pool and the stadium?
Correct.
I'm looking at my AD here. I think the stadium.
I think I can partially answer that. The concept is by funding one, we get two. And so by tag teaming this on so that the folks that with outside dollars are helping to match the funds for the pool, we can afford to do two. Whereas if we fund one, for example, if we just fund the pool, then we have to fund all of it. If we do matching dollars for the stadium at a lesser amount, then we still got to come back for 40 million for the pool. So the biggest bang for the buck by far, it's not exactly 1-to-1, but it's pretty dang close, is to fund them both at the same time, to maximize the capability to raise outside dollars for matching dollars for both projects. Is that fair?
That is, I would, Mr. Chairman, Representative Simpson, if you said to me, can you raise $1 million for the pool or 15 million for the stadium? I can raise 15 million for the stadium faster than 1 million. It's just the nature of those kind of sports, unfortunately. So I think Representative Nicholas is on a good path here. We can raise 20 million bucks. And that will help cover the cost of the pool and both projects together. Hope that answers your question.
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
I think what I heard him say is we need more swimmers playing in the NFL. Did anybody else hear that? But anyway, Mr. Chairman, I have a series of questions and it gets back to the budget, the timeframes. And so they'll be scattered out from the trustees to Bill to Tom. So I want to get this straight in my mind. So how much typically, Bill, do we put in a contingency fund from the time that the plans are done? And I'm assuming that there's going to be an escalator given the current. Is it based on CPI or just a flat 10%? So within the construction, how do we deal with building in a contingency?
Mr. Chairman, the contingencies are partially there to account for the inflation. And right now, our contingencies on the projects that we currently have going are still running in that, 10 to 15% range. And I don't anticipate that changing.
All right, thank you. And then for Trustee McKinley, so my understanding is that you only start construction once you have 100% of the money in the budget or 100% of the obligations before you actually trigger the go ahead for the construction.
Works better if you sing it.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson knows that I can't sing. So when we get the signed commitment, we treat it as funds received. That may be a little risky, but we've done it. We've done it successfully. I can think of one time when a donor backed out and that donor had filed for bankruptcy, and I think they came back around and funded stuff later. So that's how we treat it. But from a cash flow standpoint, for example, if you took Tom's example and we did the pool and the lower level first, we don't need the full 100 million that first year. We can gradually go into it from a cash flow standpoint, recognizing that cash flow we're okay. Our last construction project we finished, and I'm looking at Bill, but the engineering building, when that was finished, it came in on time, under budget, and refunded funding back to the state on that project. And so we try to do that and cash flow them so we don't have to borrow money to address the cash flow issues.
So, Mr. Chairman, follow up. So under the worst case scenario, I'm assuming that the trustees, you're ready to pull the trigger and it's $1 million or a couple of $1 million. You have access to your reserve account. So how much is in the reserve, and would the trustees then release part of that reserves to go ahead and get the building under construction, assuming a worst case scenario? So really 2 questions there. How much is in reserves, and could you potentially use some of that under a worst case scenario?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I will give you approximate numbers, and Alex is here. He knows them off the top of his head better than I do. So the general operating reserve account is right around 48 million, 50 million. That's to guard against disruptions in cash flow, whether the federal government shuts down, we have issues with cash flow. It's approximately 3 months of cash flow. That's what that's for. It's for real emergencies. We have a construction reserve account. My recollection, if we've unearmarked that now, Alex, we'd earmarked it for the dorms, and we unearmarked it. My recollection, it's 12 to 14 million, in that range, 14. And that reserve account can be used to an extent for construction, but by its definition as a reserve account, it's used for emergencies. So we don't like to use it. If everybody recalls the issues that we had with Half Acre, and the Performing Arts Building, where certain expenses were incurred at the end and that we had to cover, we didn't have a reserve account at that time, and it caused problems. But we could do that. The other thing, and I'm looking at Bill on this one, but with regard to the stadium west stands, a portion of that can be funded from major maintenance because of the type of work that would be done. Not all of it, but a portion of it. I hope that helps Senator Hicks kind of to figure out where those pots are.
Well, and Mr. Chairman, so this would go back to Mr. Berman. So, we have an estimate from the building division of 100 million. We got a $73 million request. He said he could do $20 million in fundraising, and I believe in a year, right? And in 12 months, you thought you could get commitments. Well, that still doesn't get us there. So I'm still trying to figure out if everything came through as it was presented here today, you still don't have enough money to pull the trigger. So the question is, and then what happens if you only get 18? Is there discretionary money within the existing budget to cover that differential?
So, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, let's just run some real easy numbers. 74 million. Let's say that the legislature decides to appropriate 74 million for the joint project for a total project cost of $100 million, recognizing that Tom and Foundation would make up the other 20. That gets us to 94 last time I checked. We're 6 million short. If Tom doesn't get the 6 million, then Tom has to make a request through the president, goes to the trustees to use those reserve accounts to fund the delta. Whether that delta is 6 or whether it's 8.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm looking for the reassurances that if we appropriate the money and it sits there for 2 years before we start construction, that we're actually going to have a budget to go to construction. And if it's just hinging upon $6 or $8 million, it would be nice to have the commitments for the full budget right now and not contingent upon athletic department having to come back and put in a request through the president and the trustees to go ahead and pull the trigger on the project. It seems like and I'm just worried about, well, what's been said is 100 million, the proposed budget, and then scenarios we've talked about, doesn't get to 100 million. And I need a little more reassurance that there's a process that we would examine to fund the differences. $74 million.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, there is a process. And so we don't try, the trustees don't try to front run the legislature or the state on these projects. We don't approve the project. You'll hear the law school because we haven't approved that project, even though we have private funds already raised for it. The trustees have not approved the project because it's not fully funded from the legislative standpoint. If the legislature were to appropriate the 74 million with the obligation that UW provides the balance of 26 million from any source, then that would come to our plate once you guys approve that and the ink's dry, and that gives you your assurance right there. 74 plus 26 from any source.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Who's it?
So I was having problems with my math, and Trustee McKinley might have helped me because he referenced a $74 million appropriation. And because that's not what I'm reading in my budget. And I just want to make sure that is the expectation.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz, because of the questions asked by the chairman to Bill Nye regarding the inflation factor, it took the total cost of the project from 74.3 million to approximately 100 million. So we're using the $100 million number, recognizing the testimony from Tom Berman that he could raise 20 to 25 tops. And
30. I didn't hear the cap, but I'll trust you.
So I think the materials talk about a 74.3 million total all-in cost of the project, but that's outdated because of the testimony. It's actually 100 million all-in cost of the project, with 74 being funded by an appropriation, the balance from matches from any source.
But yeah, so then, because in the budget, the way it's written, it was 36 million roughly from private sources. That was very optimistic. And we're now at a more realistic level of, what was it, 26, Tom? Or 28?
12.
But my point, I think
Whatever my
everybody
bosses
understands.
say.
We're looking at different numbers that are in the book on both lines of revenue.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz, that is correct. I mean, I don't want to, I hate playing poker against myself, but the $74 million state appropriation then makes it realistic from Tom's perspective to raise the balance. In the event that only 70 gets funded, it makes it more difficult for Tom and Bill and President Seidel to come up with the additional funds.
Senator Groom.
Question for Bill or Director Berman Knight. How old's the lower, were they the lower section and the upper section, were they built at different times? And what's the approximate age of both? What's their design life? Just from a practical standpoint, I know we want to do, but just give me some of that.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Grew, if I understood your question right, the two pieces were built in different eras. So roughly 1950, the lower level was built. And it would be it's not a stretch. Nothing has been done since 1950. So 70 years. It's basically the same structure, other than we've replaced the bleachers probably a few times. But the upper level was done in 1971. And that includes the bleachers, it's all concrete, and then the press box, which is a disaster. And that press box needs to be part of this project. It absolutely has to be. It's an embarrassment to UW and the state. But the vision on the lower level, if that's what you were asking, would be to replace, depending on funding, but if we get to the 100 million level, we can replace all but the last two sections with chairback seat, which would be great. It's what our fans have been clamoring for. We are one of the few venues left in the country that does not have any chairback seat. So we could do chairback seating in the lower level, and then gut below that, all the concessions, all the restrooms, and build out a little ways so it's more fan friendly, more comfortable. So it would actually go to the west a little ways. And then the upper level, the bleachers and everything, and the upper level concessions all stay the same. The press box would be renovated. It likely would not include premium seating. It would just be a media area and visiting president and visiting a few select visitors sections. But if during the process we find that the mid-level loge boxes that we would like to build, which are outdoor boxes, which are very popular in venues today, are too cost, the cost is too much, then we may just expand the press box to the ends, to the wings, and add some sort of indoor premium seating. That's not my preference, but it could be less costly. I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. And if I can follow up. So, and I know that when you say clamoring for, that's where the 12 to 30 million that we're hitting you up for in fundraising comes from, right? That's the definition of clamoring.
Well, I'm not going to 30. There is a line where I'm drawing the line.
I'll give you an extra week.
That's actually two different groups, as you can imagine. Our elderly fan base really would like, and they love sitting on the west side. The wind is a little less on that side. They would really like an upgrade. And that's where the chairbacks and the restrooms and concession area. ADA needs to be improved on that side. It's not adequate.
And that's, Mr. Chairman, that's what I was getting to. That lower level is 70 years old. It needs to be dealt with. And so that's where, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
just a real quick observation. I'm pretty sure it's only 49 years old. That way it's not eligible for nomination under the National Historic Preservation. I would hate to add an extra $1 or $2 million into the budget to do a mitigation on a historical structure. So I'm sure that Mr. Berman misspoke. It's only 49 years old.
I reran the numbers, 49.
So I have a question, just switching gears to the law school. That was originally 25 million. We had pledges for 5 or 6 million. Is that?
Mr. Chairman, yes.
And so the question is, because the price is going up on this silly thing, what's the likelihood of raising another million or two for private donations or some other sort?
Mr. Chairman, you are correct that for the past several years, we have commitments and gifts, pledges from more than 50 donors already in place. About half of those donations have come through, so we're about halfway to 5 million today in actual dollars. With the support of this body, and this project is not only necessary, but it's highly desired by donors, and we feel that we can raise money beyond 5 million. Not too far beyond 5 million, but we do feel like it'll instill a new confidence in our donor base to give and meet the current pledges and that we have in place and to build upon those to some degree. 1 million to 2 might be ambitious.
if this project plays out over the next year. But we do think we can go above 5 million.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? For anybody on either of these projects? So could you give us an update on the dorms? On the dorms.
Sure, Mr. Chairman. So we continue to push along on this, and as you're aware, it's a complex project, which we had initially intended to demonstrate to the committee tomorrow, and I know you have some questions of your committee. I won't interject there. What I will say is it is a complex problem or complex construction issue. We are just about through the major part of the design. I think we'll be at construction documents and ready to begin actual construction of the dorms themselves this summer. It'll be a 24 to 36 month process to build two very large and complex buildings. Not as complex as a science initiative building, though, I would guess, which we were hoping to show you in the very near future, shall we say. The project involves portions of Lewis Street. It involves portions of what we had discussed touring with the West Campus Satellite Energy Plant, which is critical to supply the energy needs of those buildings. That plant is finished and it's ready to tie into the rest of the buildings on campus. There was a major relocation renovation of utilities through that Wyoming Hall corridor. Wyoming Hall was a building built back in I think in 1950 or right in that ballpark. That building has been deconstructed. The utility tunnel that tied into that building has been relocated. That total project just to prepare that site was around a $17.5 million project. And it's pretty well wrapped up. The site's ready to go and we're ready to start construction as soon as we have final construction documents. And in fact, tomorrow in the trustees facilities contracting committee, we'll go through something that some members of the legislature have been a part of and members of the community and all of that. The final part of the exterior design analysis is now ready to go before trustees. That'll happen tomorrow. And that one has to do with the area behind the Wyoming Student Union, which is a large parking lot right now. Again, not without contentiousness, shall we say, of its various user groups. And also directed by legislative housing committee task force members. I think you will see that exterior, that final piece of the exterior, which has to do with landscaping and that green area over behind, as envisioned over behind the Union. You'll see that all incorporated into this. So there are impacts on Lewis Street, there are impacts on 15th Street, Willett Street. We, as part of all of this project, actually got some federal granting money. This was the last part of what we were going to show you, or we will show you when you show up, is the transit facility that is now located out on the very far south end of 15th Street. And in fact, if you look to the north quickly after you go underneath that Skyline Drive bridge on I-80, you look to the north and you'll see that transit facility. It's up, it's running. We have, I don't want to misspeak, but we're pretty close to having a temporary certificate of occupancy. We're starting to move our buses out there and vacating some sort of swing space parking, if that's the term, north of Lewis Street. A lot of logistics involved in this thing. So that's sort of the current status. I think to get to sort of the final part, I think the anticipated completion date for the two envisioned dorms right now, or not envisioned, but planned dorms now. Those should be up and ready to go for the fall of 24. If not fall of 24, it'll be spring of 25 within that timeframe.
And so, and on the parking structure, looks like it's in the process.
Mr. Chairman, I overlooked that one, and that's also on our planned route for you. The parking structure is coming out of the ground over off of, just for people who don't live in Laramie, it's probably out of sight, out of mind. I see it every day. And so does the president, a lot of other people at UW, but it is, just to kind of give you the orientation of this structure, it is between 10th and 11th Street, Ivinson and Grand Avenue. So it's directly south of Old Main. And most of the big concrete posts, it's a post-intention facility cast in place. Most of those they're peeling forms off of them right now. So the foundations are pretty well in, and the posts are going up. So
That's all above ground, right?
Mr. Chairman, it is all above ground. And recall that the northeast corner of that building will house the UWPD. So we're relocating them from the old Uni-YO Credit Union building that they occupy right now off of between 14th and 15th Street, between Bradley and Flint. That's all going to be pulled out, and that site, as of right now, preliminarily is anticipated to be an additional parking structure to service the next set of buildings that would be constructed. So phase 2 somewhere in the future.
So I'm curious, in terms of the original cost of construction of the dorms, what's happened with that? Because obviously you haven't bought materials. So somehow you, in terms of your bond structure, because you're funding it primarily through a bond structure, what contingency plans are you doing in order to bring that thing in line with reality of costs and construction?
Great question, Mr. Chairman, and one I ask on a pretty frequent basis, to the point where I think our UW architect gets tired of hearing from me on this one, and I hope he's listening now so he can give me a phone call when I'm driving home. The contingencies in those projects were built to take care of the inflation component. I myself, I'm pretty concerned about it. And so I ask a lot of questions. Well, worst case scenario, what if inflation amounts to this or to, and we start talking about components of the project that we're either going to pull out or shelled space, to which I say, neither of those is acceptable. We have to find a different way we have certain pieces of this project that are not negotiable. The exterior is not negotiable. The fact that we need all 900 of those beds to generate the revenue and the dining to generate the revenue to repay those bonds, not negotiable. So forget about shelled space, forget about, you need to seriously tighten down your numbers on the contingencies and all of that. And so as we approach the full construction document levels, more of those contingencies are going to be brought into play. And that's the plan for right now. Hopefully, it is all of our hope that inflation does not occur to the point that becomes a problem. As of right now, it is not.
So then, the most obvious question is, you're going to have dorms being constructed theoretically the same time you've got a pool being demolished, and the same time you've got part of the West Stands coming down. You're going to be fighting for subs, I presume, and you're going to be fighting for costs. And so you're going to have almost a self-imposed inflationary concept to it if we're not careful. And we can fund it, obviously, but we can't control that and what that campus is going to look like for 2.5 years. Realistically, I presume you guys have sat down and talked about this and thought it through, and what were your conclusions?
We have, Mr. Chairman, and in fact, the way that the dorm projects are being staged, they were mindfully sequenced so that one trade could move to the other building when the first building is complete. So we intend to have, those concrete trades and all of them able to transition from one building to the next for the life of that project. I do believe that the pool and stadium projects are enough different from the overall dorm project that I think we can compete for a different set of contractors. But you're not wrong. It's something that we do have to pay attention to there, and we don't want to compete with ourselves. There's a lot going on the Front Range too, and so. I'll tell you, the biggest fear I have in all of this construction is cannibalization of our own operations staff. And I have to make sure that we're able to pay our folks who know that campus very well and are very devoted to the UW campus, but also have families, frankly. We got to make sure we can pay our folks enough to keep them in our employment. That's my biggest concern in all of this.
And keep your hands off ours.
We'll try, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, further questions on these construction projects? Go ahead, Senator.
So the rest, when we talk about AMK Ranch and some of the other projects, make sure I understand about that. Those are now, for those who are a lesser priority, or we're looking for different funds, ARPA funds, other things for some of those projects.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I may,
Sure.
those projects were requested again as fitting at the time. And this, remember, that was before there was a lot of guidance on ARP funding. When we thought that ARP funding might be applicable for these, for example, you brought up AMK. AMK is a property that is owned by the federal government, by the National Park Service. And we thought, hey, if we can get federal dollars to address a federal site, which we have a long-term lease on and have had it for over 40 years now, what better way to fund it? We do know it's not appropriate to come to the legislature and ask for general funds to do what the federal government should frankly be helping us with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just didn't want some zoology professor to call me up and say, what the heck are you doing not funding my summer home? Okay, thanks.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Guru, just on that point more generally about the ARP request. So it may be useful to say that last April or May thereabouts, we were asked by the governor's office to come up with the best ideas that we had. And so we got together as a team and we thought through different types of requests, and we put them together in the May timeframe. That included things like the AMK Ranch and other things that are in this list. We have a ranked list of 11 priorities. We also then took those to the trustees in August last year, and we went through and we really ranked them. We vetted them more carefully. So those are there. And so that does include the AMK Ranch, for example, in our ARP request.
So with that, you want to switch over to ARPA requests?
Mr. Chairman, do you want to go through the rest of what appeared as capital construction requests from UW? All of these actually were originally ARP requests. Do you want to go through those first and then go into our ARP document, which then we probably want Alex to come up?
That'll work.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. So AMK was the first one, and if you have the CapCon budget, there's the last summary, I guess, is on page 114. It's $12 million. There's a narrative that precedes that to explain to you what really the bulk of that $12 million has to do with a dorm, lab, and dining facility that UW has had planned with the Park Service for quite a few years. I think it was originally planned in 2012. I may be off a year or so on that. But there's never been a funding source for it. And it gets a little interesting up at the Park Service too, because Grand Teton Park has its own Park Foundation fundraising arm in Teton Valley and so forth. And so it gets a little interesting for UW to try to get involved in fundraising out there. I think there is a will. There are a number of people who would like to help fund this thing, but it's just been very complicated from that standpoint. So with this ARP funding, we thought that might be a way around this. If there are no further questions on that, I'll move on to the next one.
Not seeing none, please go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, then the next project, I believe, begins on page 115. It was a total request of $800,000. Again, we requested this originally out of ARP funding, and this has to do with the intersection at 22nd and Willett Street, and that's right there to the northeast corner of the stadium parking lot. So 22nd Street is actually the other main thoroughfare through Laramie. At that intersection, at 22nd and Willett, UW owns all four corners of that real estate. The street itself is the city's, and we have worked with the city to try to figure out what the best solution is there at 22nd and Willett. And we thought, you know, this $800,000 is an estimate, a rough estimate of what we think it would take to construct a roundabout traffic flow at that intersection. That would essentially mirror a roundabout that is now currently envisioned at Willett and 15th Street as part of the housing project. So if you're going to build one, maybe it makes sense to make the campus all look the same. And frankly, the roundabout idea comes from the traffic utilization on 22nd and on Willett and wait times associated with traffic lights and all that sort of thing. So we think you could probably build a light controlled intersection there for about $300,000. To do it with a roundabout would be about $800,000. But most of the people involved in the planning in that think that the roundabout would be a superior solution on that street. Again, the governor denied that. I guess it's been determined that ARP funding is not suitable for that. Any questions on that? I'd be happy to answer.
I don't believe so. I think, and we discussed it. So.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, the next project, which actually was recommended by the governor's office, is the College of Ag Research and Extension Center's Level 3 Design and Construction. And so what the description of that is on page 120 of that CapCon book, and you'll see under the very first part, very first description, it's Laramie, Lingle, Powell, and Sheridan, and those are research and extension centers that UW currently has. And based on some of the work that UW has done very recently, that number seemed incredibly low to me. And I was unsure as to how the request was put forward. What is it exactly that we're promising we can do for that $8.6 million if the governor's rec holds? Remember, we requested that out of ARP funding. Governor recommended that out of SIPA. Okay. So that's 8.6. And I will tell you, based on work that our architect has done with the new research and extension director, who I believe has been on, I think we've got Rory here with us, but I think Eric Webster has been with UW since about July. And so he's sort of brought into the fire with us on this one with sort of little notice. This was all submitted before Eric was on board. I had UW's architect worked with the College of Ag folks and with Eric to say, look, we understand this 8.6, that's kind of gonna bandage up or triage those R&E centers. It's 4 R&E centers, and you all understand how limiting $1 million or $2 million per center is going to be. They're big places, and you're not going to get a lot done for that. So this, I would look at this as more of a, we're just going to try to bring the facilities up to a current state of repair to actually do what they need to do. When you read this description about the ranch of the future and new ideas and really bringing these things up to current needs, you're looking at more of a $30 or $35 million need in those R&E centers stretched across Wyoming. So I don't want there to be any misunderstanding that this $8.6 million is going to thoroughly modernize all of our R&E centers. It will go a long way. It will help the centers, but the College of Ag is run by ag folks who are typically pretty conservative in their approach. And, you're not going to hear a lot from those folks about how big the need is at these centers. That, I think, is reflected in this 8.6. Not that we wouldn't love to have the 8.6 to do that work, but that's the truth of the matter.
Do we have any documentation done in an agency handout on the detail on what these 3 projects would require? And if not, could we get that? I have 8.6 and it names 3 places without really telling us what they're going to do.
Mr. Chairman, I have the documents here. Do you want a real quick synopsis of what's included in this?
Is it something we have in the agency handouts already done?
If you don't have it, we'll get it for you,
Okay,
this document. Ready to move on, Mr. Chairman?
I think so.
Okay, page 124, again, is related to UW outreach and extension and AMK and Red Buttes. And so this is titled UW IT Network Upgrades Level 3 Design and Construction. And so this actually has to do with fiber optics and networks, modern communications at each of those facilities mentioned. Total of $1.95 million, and the governor did recommend that the SBC, when it was before the SBC, they were the ones that split out that private funding amount, the $215,000. And then the governor switched the funding source from that ARP request to SIPA. So that total SIPA amount now is $1,734,216, $1.7 million.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mai, do you know if the governor has a plan of what he was thinking for the private funds? Is he thinking a corporate donor that operates in the IT world contributing product, or was it just a flat go out and ask donors for money? And not to ask you to speak for him, but I didn't know if you'd have discussions with how he expected to do the private side of that in his proposal.
Mr. Chairman, if I'm recalling the conversation correctly, and it's entirely possible I'm not, there've been a lot of meetings since that State Building Commission meeting. I thought that $216,000 basically. I thought that was identified as something that UW needed to either fundraise for or identify its own funding source for. But I don't recall the specific, I will track it down and respond.
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
how did these facilities not become part of that state network that we spent so much money on back 5-7 years ago, where we wired every state building and every school in the state? How did these guys get overlooked?
Mr. Chairman, that's a great question. I'm not sure it fit into that project, but I will ask that question as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Next.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, sorry, I was writing myself a note right quick. So, Mr. Chairman, there are two related pieces that follow that I know, actually three related pieces that follow. And all of it has to do with the lab school and its interaction with the College of Education on the university campus. So the lab school is an ACSD, Albany County School District #1 school. It resides in the College of Education. And what this request reflects, this on page 128, and then the following piece on page 132. They are related. There's a UW component for observation and teaching in the lab school. And the big piece, the $30 million piece on page 132, that is the request, again, thinking that there's a possibility it might fit in some kind of ARPA funding. By the time it got to the State Building Commission for discussion, that ship had basically sailed. It was not going to be a part of ARPA. And so the discussion then kind of came back to, how do you prioritize this for school CapCon funding? It's not on any list because it's on UW's campus. It doesn't fall into a normal school building kind of prioritization. And so the discussion kind of stopped at that point, and I believe there's a recommendation for no funding for this. Governor's rec is 0.
Tom, any discussions on how at least it ought to be considered in part of the school protocol list?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we've discussed before, this one is real hinky in that the University of Wyoming owns the building. And so because there's other activities going on in that building, office space, other classroom space, when you do the condition study of that building like you would any other school building in the state, it comes out with real funny numbers because it has spaces that aren't accurate, and the condition doesn't all apply to the school portion of the building. And so I think it's been 5 or 6 years ago, they tried to do somewhat of a condition study as well as a capacity study using just the space in that building that is utilized for the school, and sort of created a hybrid model to make that condition and capacity calculation. And in doing so, it put that lab school in the top 15 roughly, knowing that about 8 of those schools are right here in Laramie County ahead of it. And so it's quite a ways up the needs list, both from a capacity and a condition standpoint. But because it is housed within property and that is not owned by a school district, and then, as I said, that building is occupied by other uses that the university has, it does make it hard to calculate and hard to figure out. I believe the university has done, and in conjunction with Albany County School District, done some work to improve the security aspect of the school. I know that's probably been 3 years ago I toured it, and at the time there was some real security risks for K-6 students that attend that school versus any other school in the state of Wyoming in terms of who could access the K-6 portion, learning environment of that building. And really it was a wide open space. Anyone could get into that building, as we were spending millions around the state to have single point of entry. In every other school, we had multiple points of entry from multiple floors in this facility. And so it really had some security issues. Some of those it sounds like have been addressed, but due to the fact that this school, I think, takes place on 3 different levels of the building, if I remember correctly, the gymnasium, the lunchroom, all of that is very problematic in terms of how they bring the food in from elsewhere in the district and then just serve it in the lunchroom there. as I said, that becomes problematic. It just has a whole lot of issues that are taking place. I think there's other opportunities. As we've discussed in the past on this project, and the reason that it's broke out into two different requests is there is the school portion where you would take the number of kids in the school, multiply it by a certain amount of square footage, and that is what we would use it for any other school in the state of Wyoming if we were building this as a standalone facility. And so that is the first request of 28 or 29, 26 million, whatever it is here. I don't have that right in front of me. And then there's a $2.5 million request that really is the university side of it to make sure that the exterior meets the university's master plan and looks good, as well as to create the teaching space for the college student. And so really what that is you have a first grade classroom with a double mirror or a double-sided window in it so that the college students sit in the back of the class and watch what that teacher is doing, interacting with the student, the first grade students within the classroom without disrupting that classroom itself. And so that's why I would call it the teaching space for teaching teachers. And that's an additional cost. And so it was always believed that because you wouldn't have that anywhere else in the state of Wyoming, that should come from a different funding source than the school capital construction account, because it's just not a normal part of building schools in the state of Wyoming. The rest of it, as Mr. Mai indicated, is owned by, and it is a Albany County school. And so it should go through the regular process of developing a school. And that's really where this has hit roadblocks, because no one was really certain who should be requesting it. Should it be Albany County School District requesting this, or should it be the University of Wyoming requesting it? And so over the last couple of years, and roadblock is probably the wrong word, but it's kind of taken some detours because there has been some question on who should be the requesting agency for this school. That's the background. If you'd like more, Mr. Chairman, I can go on for hours.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, there are a couple of things that neither Representative Walters nor I mentioned. And so for folks who haven't been to the lab school, the College of Education actually is on the northern part of the campus. It's on the north side of Prexy's pasture. The primary access into the lab school is off of Lewis Street. Remember, Lewis Street is part of what we're remodeling and redesigning as part of the housing project over there. So there's that further complication with access. Representative Walters is correct about UW addressing the security needs of the school. It's something that we've done out of our own funding to try to ensure the safety of those actually K-8 school children over there. So it also has a middle school component to it. So it's K through 4 is considered the elementary on it, and the way that they structure their classes over there is 5, 6, 7, 8 are middle school in UW Lab School lingo. So it has two different impacts for the Albany County School District, for taking up capacity considerations for them. And I think as part of what the legislature has addressed in Albany County schools over the last few years, there may be some other opportunities in Laramie as a result that could be alternatives to this design on this campus.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? What's next?
Mr. Chairman, that's it for capital construction. And I would say that if you want to go through our list of our requests, that we should probably have Alex Keene up here to do that.
Why don't we take about a 5-minute break, 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and do that. And also just kind of walk us through the WIN program along with that. So, Kevin?
Mr. Chairman, we did have Clifton Larson Allen review the CapCon budget and the school projects. None of them qualify for ARPA, with the exception of the veterans facility, and that one has timing problems with the length of ARPA, but more importantly, matching federal dollars with federal dollars is another challenge to overcome on that project. But all the remaining projects do not qualify for ARPA.
Okay, we'll 3:07, we'll be back at soon. No. no. If that's, um,
Hello, hello. Test 1, 2.
for ARP request funding. And just to remind you, as I said earlier, this was initially developed in a conversation with the governor's office about what would be good ideas. We then worked with the trustees to rank them. This goes back starting in April, May last year. Then in the August timeframe, we produced this ranked list with the trustees. At the same time, the WIP organization was gaining traction in terms of planning and so on. And some of these items have caught on with the WIP initiative as well. So in some cases, the scope of these things has grown as the WIP initiative, for example, has gotten more involved in computing and entrepreneurship and so on. So I'm going to pass it on to Steve in a few minutes to talk about the WIP request. But what I'm talking about right now is the UW ARP request as we submitted last year. So the first one in this list is called, sorry, I've got it in my notes. Support for, oh, here we go. Support for long-term investments for Tier 1 engineering, computational infrastructure, and data science. And for that, we had requested a total of $25 million. The funding for this is now related to our request for the School of Computing that is coming up to the Board of Trustees on Thursday, but also generally growing our computational capacity at the university. This would include expenditures for enhancing our computing facility within the Advanced Research Computing Center, $10 million to upgrade our computing capacity there. That also supports the engineering and science areas and also humanities and particularly corporate partnerships. So I just want to point out, we've just hired a new director for the ARC, as we call it, the Advanced Research Computing Center, who's come to us from this month from the National Center for Supercomputing Applications in Illinois. And she, for example, spearheaded the relationship with the Mayo Clinic. We had a major contract with the Mayo Clinic. A lot of us are at the age where we're starting to visit the Mayo Clinic more. And so they have a major investment in computing in collaboration with universities. So Luda, who's going to lead this effort with the Advanced Research Computing Center, spearheaded that relationship with the Mayo Clinic. So the idea for this funding would be to enhance our computing facilities, to hire research scientists who are able then to work with companies in order to secure corporate contracts that would ultimately pay for their salary, to help work with faculty that are going to become more computational, more grants from the NSF and the DOE. Very important to us that we make investments from these funds in things that will be self-sustaining. And the intention here is that we would not come back to you with a request for more money. This would help generate our ability to create more funding for ourselves. At the same time, this request in particular was exciting to the WIP initiative, to the community colleges. And so Steve can talk about a version of this. There's also been a request that grew out of this request for the Wyoming Innovation Partnership. So they're related, but our own request is for UW. So that's the top priority in this list. Any questions on that? I realize I don't want to spend too much time on these because it's getting late in the day, but I'm happy to answer questions. So the second request, the priority number 2, is development of a concentration of world-class talent. And this is in conjunction with our reorganization of the university, our intention to strengthen the science initiative and the engineering, Tier 1 engineering initiative going forward. We're doing planning for a phase 2 of both the science initiative and the engineering, the Tier 1 engineering, as well as areas in technology where we want to be able to recruit faculty who strengthen our ability to get funds from outside sources, from companies, from federal agencies like the science agencies and so on, and to help strengthen our ability for tech transfer and to create new companies. And so within this funding, again, it's a request for $20 million. It would allow us to provide funding to attract top-notch faculty from across the country to enhance our ability to do these kinds of things around science, technology, computing, and so on. Again, this is not a request that would lead to recurring funding. It's something that would allow us to do a burst of hires in the next few years as we're recruiting new deans and and top-notch faculty to help enhance our ability for external funding.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Mr. President, do you mind addressing, so if you're attracting world-class talent, but you're using one-time dollars, do you see any challenges there with convincing someone to, come here, where one-time funding, money might be gone in a couple of years?
No, Mr. Chairman and Representative Stith, it's actually the other way around. I just spent yesterday the whole day interviewing 10 candidates for new Vice President for Research and Economic Development, and I told them about some of these initiatives. And every single one of them told me how exciting they thought this was, how it definitely attracted them to come to the University of Wyoming. So I think it increases our ability, if they see this momentum, to be able to recruit faculty. And the idea is this would provide the ability, if we get a material scientist who needs an electron microscope or something, we would then have the ability to provide that for attracting these faculty. This also would go for supporting grad students and postdocs, and that's what's called startup funds, with the intention that within 3 years, you better be funding all of these activities with external grants. So we'll look specifically at people who can do this and who are interested in doing the technology transfer. As we build up our tech transfer office, we have faculty who are more attuned to the idea of trying to start up companies to help grow the economy. So these are the kinds of people that we would be able to attract with these funds.
So, what's interesting about this concept and this approach, part of the School of Energy Resources had the same kind of underlying principle when it was put together. But instead of that really happening, what happened was a lot of the engineering staff moved over to SER, got a pay raise, and then had guaranteed income, so they didn't have to raise money as much. I mean, that's my understanding of it. And so, it's to me, it's a real issue on campus-wide, but particularly on the engineering side, is that what we want are not folks who have a pedigree that's a mile long and they're 55 years old and are on the downhill swing. We want young, energetic folks that are going to be there and that will start something that will carry on for generations. And so it has a lot to do with who you look for and what, and how you're recruiting them to get the bang for your buck and actually be aggressive enough to go out and get the grants and not find another avenue to rest their career on. And it's I think some of us have recognized that problem over in the past at UW, and the promises made are not necessarily promises kept. So when you say one-time funding, we hear that all the time, and it's something that we take to heart. In fact, what we need to do is keep a scoreboard, and we just pull down the screen and say, this is what they said in 2012 when we did this.
Mr. Chairman, I hear what you're saying. And first of all, I would say we want faculty who are going to be entrepreneurial themselves. One of my pillars for the university is being more entrepreneurial. That means faculty, deans, staff being more hustling to achieve funding from outside coming to this committee for sure. And that's the way it works. And you can hold me accountable, and I will hold my faculty accountable for the same things.
All right.
Please. Thanks. So let me then continue on. So priority number 3 is what's called transforming and enhancing the undergraduate STEM education to build the workforce for the future. This is another one that is not a recurring request, but it is one that would allow us to build out laboratories and facilities that are still needed within the Science Initiative building. That would be laboratories for students and to help turbocharge the Science Initiative, which you'll see the building I guess if you're able to come next a week from tomorrow. And so that includes a thing called the Scroll, the Student Collaborative Research Outreach and Learning Laboratory, and also some funding for supporting biology research and so on.
Go ahead.
So did I hear you correctly? So it's to just finish building out the science building and how to say that again?
Yes, there are some laboratories within the science building that are being framed out, but have not been, there wasn't enough funding to complete some of the laboratory equipment that was needed within.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. Then for me, what makes it easier for me to understand is in this narrative is to build out the science building. not this transform and enhance undergraduate education to build the workforce for the future.
It's,
The description helps us to understand that a little better. Your explanation makes more sense.
well, it's both, Representative Larson. So for example, the students are needing to learn science in a new way. And the science building is actually organized specifically around new methodologies for teaching science that are shown to be significantly more effective. So in that sense, it's around creating the workforce for the future and more effectively teaching science. But it's also laboratories that they would use where these would be carried out.
So my understanding of the building also is that it's kind of for the best and the brightest, and it's a competition on who gets to be there.
In terms of the faculty, right,
Right,
it would be accessible to any students, but for faculty, we want to make sure that the people are doing things there that they can't do anywhere else. And the facilities would be
So they
allowing
come
that.
together, they come, bring a proposal, it gets evaluated, and the top one rises to the top.
Mhm.
Whether it's a 1 year, 2-year, 3-year stint, then it's reevaluated and you start all over again, basically.
Mr. Chairman, that is exactly the way I intend to drive the science building going forward. Projects will be studied for merit, and then faculty groups will be able to come in and work in there and to do things that they couldn't do in their home departments. And so then those will be reviewed over time.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, so the next one on this list is priority number 4. This again has overlap with the WIP initiative. It's around funding the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. And I've described this a few times, but the main point here is that it would allow us to staff up corporate partnership staff. We have a plan to build a corporate partnership office that includes people from the foundation, from the research, from the provost office, from the research vice president of research office. So we would think about internships for students and faculty, partnerships around philanthropy, and also sponsored research from companies. We think that in the end will help pay for itself as we grow our ability to attract companies both to work with us. I have a plan in place, or being developed, I should say, to think about building out the research park on the north side of town in Laramie. There's a building there, Cirrus Sky is there with I'm just blanking on the name, but the lab, UL Labs is there at the moment. But we'd like to grow that significantly. So that's part of our plan of having companies come and set up shop next to the campus. And so anyway, building the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation will also support training for entrepreneurs. We're talking about building a venture capital fund that the university itself would manage. And so we're putting in plans for that right now. And so this funding is allowing us to get a sort of a jump start on that. This is one that also was very interesting to the WIP initiative, to the community college partners, and Steve can talk about the overlap with that activity. So I'm just, if it's all right, I'll just keep moving through here because I really don't want to take too much time on these, but happy to answer details of questions. The next one is around the addressing teacher success and student success. And so again, this is something that's coming out of the College of Education. Dean Thomas is possibly available on Zoom. On the other hand, it is one that would help address the need for increasing training for students and that would become teachers. And the state is significantly in a deficit right now in terms of teachers. So we would develop teacher cadets programs and things to enhance what some of you might know as the Trustees Education Initiative, going to the next step with that. Shall I just go on? It's probably best to complete, and then I want to pass it on to Steve for the WIP initiative. The next priority is number 6, the Wyoming Data Hub. This is a very interesting project that, again, the community colleges got very excited about, but with the instruments that we're putting in place in the science initiative and then across with the engineering initiatives, we have the capacity not just to have an instrument used by a faculty member, but to connect it up to data services so the data from these instruments can be made available to anybody on campus so that we can extend the reach of what an instrument, the data from an electron microscope or from another scientific instrument, an NMR machine. how those machines could provide data, a DNA sequencer. The data could then be provided to others across campus, also to others across the state through the WIP initiative. Community colleges would be able to participate in scientific experiments that are done on campus. And so providing data that would make it possible for people to remotely access these instruments is what this data hub would do. Really interestingly, it's something that companies are very interested in. So for example, the High Bay Research Facility has unique ability to understand, to do not sequencing, but imaging of rocks. So we understand how fluid might flow through the rock, for example, in formations where there could be oil and gas. So we have a plan to create what we call digital twins for these rocks samples that then could be made available to companies so that they have a better sense of what is their capacity for extracting oil and gas or enhancing that. So the idea is to build a data hub that can provide data services for either companies or for other scientists across the campus or across the state. And this is something that is in part $4 million was requested out for the Wyoming Innovation Partnership. And that project is already beginning to move forward. So there's some overlap from some of these projects.
On the data hub, essentially, it's just a small data retention like we have here in town.
It's like a data storage facility, but not just to store the data, but then to serve the data up for others to access it. So that requires some curation of the data and some computation, some tools to be able to manipulate the data and to get value from it.
And then you've got, it's basically a 5-year lifespan. So then you'll have to come in and upgrade it, essentially repackage it every 5 years.
Could be, it could be, I would say, but right now, what we hope is that if there's enough interest, which there already is, that's the kind of thing that getting funding from the National Science Foundation or from corporate partnerships would be a very viable path for continuing funding for that in the future.
Okay, go ahead.
I once oversaw the data program at the NSF, so I know that there's a lot of interest in funding those things. So let me move on. The next one is the AMK Ranch. We've already talked about that, and so that was initially proposed as an ARP request, and so it's made its way into the CapCon as well. The next one I would say is around renovations for the College of Agriculture. So there was this number 8 priority, agricultural research and extension renovations. Wari Means is here if you wanted to hear more details about it. But as Bill Mai made a comment a little while ago, the request, the $8.6 million, is not nowhere near enough for what's needed to really build out the entire renovation of ag extension renovations and so on. So this details in more depth what that plan would be. The next one, and I'm almost at the end of this list here, is the Wyoming Outdoor Recreation, Tourism, and Hospitality Center, or WORTH, the WORTH initiative. And again, this is something, after talking a lot with people across the state, it's a major economic driver for the state. And we want the university to be a good citizen in terms of creating programs that help support the growth of important economic sectors. This is one that's gotten a lot of support from the Help School, the College of Business, the Ag School, and others. Even the history department is interested in this to give you a sense of how broadly this is of interest. So we had a request for $1.2 million just to help get some of the initial activities going. This is one that, again, caught a lot of interest from the WIP initiative. And in fact, there's a component in the WIP initiative. The scope grew significantly. And so Steve can talk about the WORTH initiative from the point of view of the WIP. However, there's still a need for this within the University of Wyoming. And if it's all right, I'll just try to finish out
The
here.
1.2 is a startup dollars. What do you envision
It's-
ongoing costs?
We've earmarked money from within the university to build this program out in terms of funding faculty. And it's part of the reorganization and the budget that was approved by the board last year. So I forgot the exact amount. I think it's $1.5 million recurring. It's something like roughly that amount of money. But we need some money just to get some administrative startup and to get the program rolling initially. We also have significant interest from some donors as well to build that program.
So we can put that in the one-time funding?
One-time funding for sure. Yeah, I promise. Okay.
Go ahead.
I love those, I love those promises, but be careful what you promise. Question, Mr. Chairman. So is this designed for the startup money, or is this program going to be stood up with existing faculty? Or are we looking at adding faculty? And so this is what for the 1.2? Is it classroom materials, graduate research assistantships, scholarships, or what?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, it's some administrative support to get the center going itself. We would have existing faculty that we have already a lot of interest in spending time on this. We would likely recruit some additional faculty going forward that would be funded from our internal allocation of funds.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I know time is flying, so I want to try to finish up here. So priority number 10 in this list is called the Ranch of the Future. This is one that, again, I think we got quite excited about talking with the College of Agriculture about all of the changes. I mentioned already the idea that there's a completely autonomous tractor that was just introduced, computing, drones. There's a company called Herd Dog that's just moved into Laramie that is all about using RFIDs and other technologies in order to track cattle and so on. So also on the finance side, blockchain is potentially going to have a huge impact in the finance side of ranching. And so our plan here would be to put together a prototype ranch that we've talked with some of the ranches out there that are very interested in partners. We spent a whole day at the Padlock Ranch out in, I don't know, somewhere north, in the north part of Wyoming, up outside of Sheridan, right? And back in August and September, and we talked with a lot of the folks there about how to create a prototype ranch of the future. So this funding would be to allow us to get this, this kind of project started in collaboration with ranches and with other companies. Community colleges were interested in this one as well. And then the priority number 11 here is about a lack of access to healthcare for a thriving economy. And these were funds that were requested. Again, this was put together for the governor's request around how could we use ARP funding. And it would be to help grow our ability, particularly around rural healthcare and a Rural Healthcare Innovation Institute. This is something that the governor has been promoting a lot lately, and it's something that has most recently come up again in the Wyoming Innovation Partnership Program. So I think that's the last one in this list. Is that right? The others we've already spoken to. So if it's all right, I would like to hand it over to Steve to talk about the WHIP initiative, for which there was some overlap.
Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if I may just provide maybe a little more historical context relative to how we got to where we are.
As pull the mic a little closer. Thanks.
Okay. As has been referenced here today, as part of our phase 1 funding, the governor did allocate roughly $27 million in support of what we are deeming phase 1 activities. And to understand how that funding has been structured is when that tranche of funds came in, it was in a collaboration with the Wyoming Community College Commission relative to where will those dollars go. And there was consensus between all the presidents, both at the community colleges and at the university, as we thought about programmatic infrastructure investments to where we could prove out measured activities as part of a phase 1 scenario that would demonstrate that phase 2 and 3 investments, or the balance of the $55 million that has been designated, would be appropriated to continue to support those activities. And just to give you some additional insight as to how where those dollars landed. And again, these are shared dollars between the University of Wyoming and the community colleges. One area that was identified as consortial infrastructure. And in principle, what that represents is back office support. So shared back office support, project management type activities, both at the commission and at the university, working in collaboration to really track these investments and the activities to point toward these measured outcomes. There was investments made and or investments currently under consideration to look at course sharing platforms so that there is increased capacity around sharing of courses for our students around the state and participation and clear pathways for our students, both whether they start at the community college level and understand what that translates to at the university. Investments made around enhancing our capacity around virtual learning and distance education so that students can participate in these programs within their respective communities. There is an area designated to energy, and specifically the community colleges are participating in that area. As part of this conversation too, is that there was recognition as part of piloting these investments that there may not be 100% participation with all institutions. Some institutions were ready now and could take a leadership role, and as they were to have discussions around program designs or investments, it was with the intention that eventually all communities could participate in these programs. So both in terms of understanding what those communities could support now, but then also soliciting input from other community colleges that may not be participating here in the short term, to understand how those programs and those investments could be adapted to support statewide activity or statewide participation. In the areas of entrepreneurship, President Seidel has talked about some seed funding for the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. Again, recognition between the community colleges and the university is that we're somewhat fragmented when it comes to entrepreneurial innovation assets. The Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, although led by the university, would solicit broad participation from the state. And these early seed investments include piloting programs in 3 initial communities, Rock Springs, Cheyenne, and Riverton, to broaden our Impact 307 programming, which is a business incubator supporting new business startups, but also includes conversations around expansion of the business resource network. So in addition to supporting new business starts, it'll be a destination for our existing business communities to have access to SBDC, our manufacturing work, so we can help our existing businesses think in innovative ways and continue to support the respective communities that they're in. There was dollars designated to support innovation workshops, student projects, and as President Seidel said, to start seeding investments around what do these corporate partnerships programs look like across the state. And again, as we say corporate partnerships, we want to make sure that this is broad business participation and not necessarily stereotyping large corporations, as we want to have small, medium, and large businesses throughout the state participating in these partnership and/or engagement opportunities. As we think about digital infrastructure technology, another category here, further enhancement of the software development program that we worked with our community colleges on earlier this spring, which we had broad participation in, and that'll translate to a 2-year program at the community colleges, which all students at the community college levels can participate in, but it will have incorporated within a clear pathway to receiving a bachelor's degree at the University of Wyoming. Seed money towards the School of Computing, seed money towards the Wyoming Data Hub we just discussed, and building out our fintech and our blockchain curriculum programming for our students to participate in the support of new businesses that are coming here and to support the demands for talent that these companies are looking for. We just touched on hospitality and tourism. Money towards establishing training programs to support our existing workforce. Again, this is a collaborative initiative with the university and our community colleges, leveraging existing curricular investments already made around certificates and other programs to support that business community. Emphasis on culinary and hotel and restaurant management. Then also money towards supporting the initiative around the Wyoming Outdoor Recreation, Tourism, and Hospitality Center. Now, after these dollars were designated, immediate work went underway to create working groups, which has participation, both university and community colleges. So right now there are count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 category working groups, and with underneath that subcategories that are very specific to supporting the activities I've just described. So for example, in entrepreneurship, I am working with President Tyndall from CWC and coordinating 3 working groups around building out the CEI, which includes representation from the university and the community colleges. We have expansion of makerspace availability, which again includes representatives from UW and our community colleges, and innovation workshops and corporate engagement, again, which includes representation from those institutions. All these categories from back office support, energy, entrepreneurship, digital infrastructure, tourism, hospitality, and healthcare now include this broad participation and collaborative engagement around how do we pilot these programs here in the short term, keeping in mind that the programs as designed have intention to be distributed statewide. So as they think about the program design, they are also looking at how do I back in, or how do we back into very measurable outcomes, as we understand that as part of this phase one, our ability to prove out these activities in measured ways will help justify the additional investments as part of phase 2 and 3. And just for some broad examples of what those metrics look like, it's from new business starts, supporting our existing business communities, jobs, wages, increases in research and development, as well as, and an important topic for all of us here is the retention conversation. How do we align these programmatic activities and infrastructure investments in ways that supports our existing workforce and the workforces in the pipeline, so that there is a retention story to be told for our students, as well as the existing workforce that may be transitioning as we think about a new economy here in the state. So hopefully that gives you some additional context or how we're positioning ourselves, where these initial investments have gone, and keeping top of mind on our end here relative to how we think about arming this group with data points that'll suggest that additional investment should flow.
So when will we have that data to analyze and review to make that determination?
So, Mr. Chairman, we have set a target date. We have a January 25 presidential steering group, of which we will combine our efforts to date to show these short-term measured activities in the areas that I've just described. I should also point to that we have.
So before you go on, but as part of that, I think would be critical that we see where all the money has gone, or everything that was received. In other words, a balance sheet or an accounting of it. So we know where it's going. And because, I mean, your list was fairly exhaustive, and you're doing a lot of things with a lot of different tools. So we're going to have to look at all of it and to have even an idea of how to assimilate the information you just gave us. And even though you can give us a preliminary guideline, I mean, you're not going to have any data results. So when do you anticipate having data results? I mean, how can you have it by February 15th, or let's say February 30th, for us to do something this year? Or how do we create, otherwise we're going to have to create some type of yeah, you've met it, so you don't get the money, or a committee or somebody's going to say between now and next year. How do we do that?
So, Mr. Chairman, as part of the activity that is underway for each of these categories I've described, these category groups have taken those initial investments and have broken them down into budgetary considerations. So there are specific line items that backs into the aggregate allocation to those activities. Those budgets are being reviewed and approved, and then that'll dictate the activity that we will engage in, and hopefully translate to the short-term measured activity that we can report back to this group, so we can show here's the aggregate investment, here's the breakdown investment by infrastructure, programmatic activity, et cetera. And then here are the outcomes of those activities to point back to, for better choice of words, return on investment.
And so your phase 2, phase 3 funding, how do you know when you're going to need it?
So our phase 1, we need to look at how we look at our timetables that we've established for ourselves. And let me respond to that, Mr. Chairman.
Well, while Steve's looking, I'll just say the phase 1 funding is with specific targets of accomplishment in the short term, is around the idea of standing up certain organizations, like getting the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation functioning, or hiring the ARC director to help support computing across the state, or beginning a software engineering program, beginning to launch that. So having plans in place. The further funds are for further programmatic activities in phase 2 and so on.
So, Mr. Chairman, when we were requesting these dollars, there was an assumption that we might see those dollars sooner than when we did. And so we recognized that this was going to be a very aggressive timetable to prove out some sort of measured activity and or a deliverable ahead of the session. Our intent is to come to this group before the session with examples of what these short-term measured activities are. As it relates to how we are structuring our time, again, we've set ourselves up within 3 phases. Phase 1 is now through June of 22. Again, recognizing that a lot of these are seed or preliminary investments to really give us an indication of activities underway should they support additional phase 2 and 3 investments. From July of 2022 through June of 2024, our focus now is additional measured activities in support of workforce development, scaling our academic programmatic collaborations, and ensuring that we are demonstrating statewide reach. As we get into phase 3, which would commence July of 2024, we hope by then from our early investments and measured activities, how do we focus now our efforts around those activities that we consider to be sustainable? We recognize that these are one-time funds, and we recognize as part of that consideration too is where are the alternative sources of funding going to come from if the group decides that these are go-forward programs that the state would like to see us deliver on.
Yeah, anything, go ahead. Further questions? So does part of this project then, when you're measuring outcomes, or what components of it can become or ought to become self-funding?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, if you could repeat the question.
Yeah, self-promoting.
What should become self-funded?
Any parts of it, of what you're doing or how you're doing, and in terms of is that part of your analysis of whether or not you've met your goals?
Absolutely. So as we think about some of these programmatic activities, we've heard a lot of talk about corporate partnership activities in support of programs that companies could be active participants of which they're assigning value to. We've also explored, as we think about the build out of these respective entities, that they become destinations for new sources of grants and other maybe potential federal funding. So in essence, we're building programs and an infrastructure and support that should translate to private source of funding in addition to public source of funding, say through the federal levels. But I'd like to also think, as we think about some of the program activities, that there's also additional source of revenue through either tuition or other programs whereby as companies participate in certificates and other mechanisms by which people are willing to pay to participate in, that becomes also another source of revenue. Our faculty sponsored research, I think, is going to, and as we think about applied research within the state, a lot of companies are going to be looking to not only look to our faculty in terms of innovative ways to engage in those research, but how does it apply to their respective industries and some of the economic sectors that we've identified as priorities to the state. So those are all key considerations for us as we think about a sustainability plan post 2024 is what do these one-time dollars, what do they represent in terms of not only demonstrating that there's demand, but then also that there's a conversation around that these are additional dollars that could be supported through other sources, i.e. private or federal.
Okay, further questions? Please proceed.
Mr.
Anything
Chairman,
else? Yeah.
do you have I've got something on the ARPA. I don't have a document on everything that you've read for us. It might be something we've been given previously. But you had quite a bit more data, quite a bit more information there than I seem to recall previously. If you've got a document that you could send to me, that would be helpful. And that's first. Second, you said there's an overlap between WIP and ARPA, and I haven't heard about where that overlap is, but I might be jumping the gun on the presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kinski. So we can provide documents. We have, what we probably need to do is just create a particular document for you all as opposed to the voluminous plans that we are developing within. So we can do that in very short order to provide you a document about the WIP initiative and how it's being managed. In particular, these various initiatives that Steve is looking at, we can lay that out for you, as well as what our short-term deliverables are for phase 1 and what our intentions are for phase 2. So we're happy to do that. And we'll do that as quickly as we can do it within a couple of weeks or something like that. We could.
I don't know how voluminous is, but part of what disturbs me is I've seen it's just very generic and in the form that I can't really get my head around. So if we're talking about an encyclopedia, then probably not. But if you've got something that puts a little more flesh on the bones and provides a little more detail, I might draw some assurance.
We do, and we'll provide that to Senator Kinski, including specific deliverables and with dates, those kind of things I think you'd like to see. Secondly, on the overlap, some of these initiatives grew out of our very early planning as I was talking about the UW ARP requests and those 11 projects. So one of them, for example, was around the computing initiatives that have now taken root within the WIP request as well. And so we can point out that those documents actually describe similar kinds of outcomes and similar kinds of funding. The reason why they've come up twice is we first prepared it for UW, and then the plans evolved and have been developed with the WIP initiative, but we're happy to point out the overlap of those. Also, the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, very similar language with similar kinds of goals and so on there. I think there were 4 different projects for which there was overlap because they caught on with the WIP initiative. And so that's why there's overlap.
Well, and in addition to overlap, you're kind of doing the same thing. So we need to know overlap of funding or programs. And is there an overlap of funding? In other words, if we fund one, are we partially funding part of that overlap?
Right.
How do we know that?
Right. Mr. Chairman, and we understand this has been confusing. It's also, the plans are not completely fleshed out within the WIP they're developing. If the original request was for $100 million for the entire WIP initiative, that's now been reduced to $55 million at the recommendation of the governor. So there's still some gray areas there about how much money what might come from one or from the other. But our intention is not to double count or to double fund, is to make sure we do the right thing.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
please,
if I may. And so with that, and I don't know if this has it, but the one thing that would be very beneficial for me is just see a budget. How much is personnel? And is that personnel at junior colleges?
Yeah.
Is it the university? Is it support staff? Is it faculty? How much is contract? How much is travel? And do we have a budget for the overall WIP proposal out there that can not only tell me with the immediate $27 million that I think was already been obligated, but what's an ongoing standard budget for the program going forward? What's one time and then source of funding? And so right now I need that information to make good decisions. So if that's available, I would certainly like to see and if it's not a detail, but whatever you have would be where the funds are going, how they're going to be spent, and what's a standard budget for the WIP program look like going forward.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Hicks, we totally understand this. Steve and I talk a lot about this. We can provide you some information on this.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Steve, are we there?
Are we there? Just, I'm available for any additional questions,
Okay.
Chairman. Anybody has any?
Any further questions? Anything else for UW? Anything we're missing, Don? Have we covered everything? Any closure?
It's been great spending the day with you today. And we had a chance to do a little economic development support for lunch as well in town. So we're always happy to do that as well.
Always like that. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming back. We sorry to steal your whole day. And you stole half of our day. We were supposed to do other things this afternoon. I'd be on the way to Laramie right now. That's too bad. Okay, thank you very much. Let's take a quick break, let everyone clear out, and then we'll kind of reorganize for the rest of the day and for tomorrow, all right? Yeah, we'll enjoy this. Yeah.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. On Wednesday, January 12th, you'll start off with the Business Council for about an hour, Insurance Department for 30 minutes on EORC, that's the Enhanced Oil Recovery. Then we have a scheduled break, followed by the Office of State Lands and Investments for the balance of the morning, about an hour and 45 minutes on that agency. Then the lunch break, and following the lunch break is 2 hours with the Department of Corrections. I will say in advance, the Department of Corrections is by far the most complicated and difficult budget, including the Department of Health, that you will see this year. But really, if you just step back, there's not a lot of meaningful, substantive exception requests. They have a major reorganization going on in their department, which nets to zero a number of so they're taking some people from one unit and putting them in another. That is a little bit complicated by the fact that their HR consolidation is not just at the administrative level. They have HR folks that are embedded in each of the institutions throughout the state. So sometimes they have that HR going on at the same time as the reorg. So it's complicated, but at the end of the day, one more feature that makes it complicated is they've switched all of their funding, as you know, from general funds to these federal ARP funds in order to conserve general funds. All three of these things really don't have a meaningful impact on the bottom line. They're tough for the technocrats like us, but the end of the day thing is not
If it's an
significant.
extraordinary complex budget, this is just a group of rocket scientists.
Mr. Chairman, you are scheduled to adjourn, of course, a little bit early, and I know your plans have changed, so maybe tomorrow you can do what maybe you'd plan to do this afternoon.
Yeah, I think we'll adjourn between 2 and 3 in all probability, if not sooner. And then we'll probably, it's not really executive session, but I think we'll have an informal review conference where we're just reviewing each other's notes on the ARPA and just a general discussion between us. So that's our agenda for tomorrow. And then anything new for Thursday or Friday?
Mr. Chairman, we have republished the agenda on the website. Your callbacks, well, first of all, you have one more agency on Thursday morning. Your last agency is the State Parks and Cultural Resources. And then the callbacks that day include the Department of A&I, Department of Education, and the AG. You'll recall the AG was going to discuss capital cases as well as what appears to be 3 different firing ranges up at the Post Academy. Department of Education was going to speak to the status of the waiver application for the maintenance of equity and maintenance of financial support. And the Department of Administration and Information was going to discuss risk management, HR consolidation, and I think a member or two had some questions on the compensation plan. We've also scheduled a number of the small bills. If you don't mind me walking through that. Again, these are relatively straightforward. The Chancery Court extension to that date. Local government distributions is scheduled in the afternoon. That's the $105 million direct distribution. Wyoming Council for Women's Issues, workers' compensation related to COVID-19 presumption, and the employment support amendments. On Friday, we start off with a presentation of the Craig report. We have some time there that will probably populate with any additional agency callbacks if you have any. So, and we also will probably populate some additional bill drafts that we discussed at noon today. And those bills for the committee's edification will include some language regarding the authority to spend ARP funds, legislative involvement in EGI rate holidays, the investment of game and fish operating funds, and there's an issue regarding the Board of Psychology and the certification of certain personnel in the Wyoming State Hospital and Wyoming Life Resource Center. I believe And we may not include all of those on Friday just because of the number of bills. We do have one more callback on Friday, and that's the state geologist, Aaron Campbell, to discuss the rare earths. And apparently there's a federal grant associated with her request. I have learned this afternoon that there's also a governor's letter on the same topic. So I think that communication went out in multiple
And then,
ways.
Don, after we went through the governor's ARPA sheet, we asked Don this morning or last night to have a call back from the governor's office to help explain some of the programs that he is funding, because there's just not enough information out there. But whether that will be this week or next week, just want to let you guys know that we asked.
Mr. Chairman, indeed, that is the last item on the day on Friday. We have the governor's letters, and I believe the chief of staff, Buck McVeigh, will be presenting those along with Rennie McKay and potentially your Kevin Hibbard and Erica Legursky here on staff. At that time, or upon the conclusion of those letters, they have been forwarded a range of questions regarding the ARP requests and the details therein. So they may be able to respond to those questions at that time.
Can you forward to them what our questions were?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman.
So let me ask you this, because I had questions on every one of them, but some of them I just said.
Okay.
Or did you have questions on every one of those?
Oh, there's lots of questions.
Every one of those programs?
The ones that we thought were legitimate.
Okay.
Go ahead, Senator Groom.
Thank you, Don. Were there any letters from anyone else? I remember the treasurer saying he might be sending a letter, and I just wanted to know if we'd seen any other.
Mr. Chairman, we have not seen any letters. I do anticipate a letter from the Wyoming Department of Education, primarily because of the change in Craig changes their entitlement payments modestly, as well as they have incorporated the new enrollment counts. And I'm also anticipating a letter from the judiciary relative to their potential ARP requests.
Okay, with that, anything further we need to discuss today? Seeing none, we'll stand adjourned till 8 o'clock tomorrow.